And we're pleased to welcome tonight Professor Gregory Sadler. In case you couldn't read, his talk is Aristotle's multidimensional analysis of anger. We'll run for a while, we'll do his thing, we'll have some Q&A. And please welcome Professor Sadler.
Thanks. So you notice Aristotle looking very martial here in this image of him. And this is actually uncharacteristic, but it fits the sense of anger, sternness, and all that. It's kind of a funny image for me. I like it because Aristotle and his followers were known in ancient times for being kind of snazzy dressers and being a little bit on the soft side. And Aristotle was actually faulted for wearing too many rings, and too much pride in his appearance. So this is a kind of an uncharacteristic image of him, but this is one that you'll see on a lot of websites. What I'm going to talk about tonight, I'm writing a book on Aristotle and anger. I'm going to talk about 6 different dimensions to anger as Aristotle treats it in his work. But first, before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about why research this at all, why is it interesting. For Aristotle, anger has a unique status, and this is not just him. There's other theorists that you could think of. Plato, for example, with Thumos, however we're going to translate that, having a particular role in moral psychology. Also later on with people who were influenced by Aristotle, like Thomas Aquinas, anger is going to have a sort of unique status among the passions or the emotions of the soul. And one reason why it has this status is because anger is uniquely concerned with our sense of justice and injustice. A lot of the other passions are concerned with things that affect us, other moral values, pleasure, pain, a sense of beauty, ugliness, things being discordant. But anger is uniquely concerned with justice. I got interested in Aristotle in part because Aristotle's views on anger, in part because he is also not unique, but he stands out in the ancient world as being somebody who saw anger as having a legitimate role in moral life. And this again is tied in with the sense of justice and injustice. As opposed to, say, the Stoics or the Epicureans, or even, for the most part, the Platonists. Anger does have some role in things there. They tended to look at anger as a bad thing. Aristotle doesn't see anger as a good thing, where we should all be angry all the time as much as we possibly can. But he has a role for it in his moral psychology and in his ethics. He thinks that we ought to get angry at certain times, that if we don't get angry in certain cases, there's something wrong with us. So that's rather unique, and that transposes itself into the Middle Ages and into discussions about anger, which are influenced by a lot of other factors. We can talk about that more in the Q&A. But Aristotle's account coming through really changes the picture. So I'm interested in it for that reason. Aristotle's account of anger is very sophisticated. He doesn't just treat it from one angle. That's part of why I'm doing this talk to begin with. As I did more and more work and more writing and thinking about this, I came to realize that Aristotle was actually treating anger from a variety of different perspectives throughout his different texts, and that these weren't really reducible to each other. It also allowed me to do what I like to call philosophical detective work, which is something I enjoy doing, some of you may enjoy doing as well, where you have to look across a person's works. Aristotle never wrote a treatise on anger. If you want to know what he thinks about anger, you have to read a bunch of different texts, and you have to put together a composite picture that comes from them. So if you were only to go by what you saw, say, in the Rhetoric, and quite often philosophers don't read the Rhetoric. It's more political science people on the one hand, or English people on the other hand that read it. Philosophers don't often read it, but if you don't read it, you miss a lot of his remarks about anger that fill in the picture. Likewise, there's important remarks about it in the politics, in the 2 different ethics. So you have to form a composite picture, and you have to do a lot of correlating of things. I like to do that, so that's why I'm writing a book doing that. There are some challenges to studying Aristotle on anger. Some of these are challenges that are inherent in studying Aristotle anyway. He wrote in Greek. The Greeks had a lot of different terminology for anger. As a matter of fact, there's two words that Aristotle uses almost interchangeably. You have to look at individual circumstances to decide whether they mean the same thing. One of them is thumos, which if you read Plato, you know from the Republic, is that spirited, passionate third thing in between reason and the appetites. And the other is orge, what often gets translated in other texts as wrath, but in the Aristotelian corpus is anger. And the Greeks had some other words for it too, manus, but Aristotle doesn't use those too much. And then he uses an entire host of verbs for anger, a lot more than just the noun. And he uses a lot of different adjectives to describe people being angry or how they're angry. And part of the problem is, when Greek texts are translated into English, these common ideas that you see occurring in this text, in this text, in this text, they often get lost in translation because you'll have different people translating the text, looking at it from different angles. So if one person translates thumos as spirit, and another person translates it as passion, and yet another person translates it as anger, if you don't have Greek, you wouldn't recognize that they're all talking about the same thing. And that is actually how thumos has been translated in a lot of these texts. Another challenge is the fact that anger is spread throughout Aristotle's texts. So you can't just go by what you get in the Nicomachean Ethics or in the Rhetoric, although those are the probably two most important places to go. The other thing is Aristotle had different things in mind when he was looking at anger in these different texts. So in the Topics, he's not really interested in trying to define anger, except insofar as he's interested in how do you define anything, and he's using it as an example. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he's much more interested in, what are the virtues and vices associated with it. He doesn't bother to define it in the Nicomachean Ethics. He figures, well, everyone knows what anger is, what it feels like to be angry. In the Rhetoric, he actually settles down and gives you a definition, but he's not interested really in whether a person is rightly angry or wrongly angry. He's interested in, if you're a rhetor, if you're an orator, how do you make the crowd angry when you want to? And how do you quell that anger in them if you want to? So he's got all these different frameworks that he's looking at it through. And that can make it difficult, I think, for somebody approaching this to put all the pieces together. And so that's part of what my project is trying to do. I've got a few passages here. And if you looked at these passages and you had to sort of pick, what's his focus? What sort of way of looking at things? Is he looking at things in a sort of physicalist, paying attention to the material aspect way? Is he looking at anger as an emotion? Is he looking at it as an explanation for human action? Is he looking at it as a moral phenomenon? You could look at these and say, well, which do they fit in? The first one shows you why anger is so important. It says every action must be due to one or other of 7 causes: chance, nature, compulsion, habit, reasoning, anger, or appetite. So all human action, this is something he says in the Rhetoric, all human action can be explained by reference to at least one of these, probably a whole bunch of them functioning together if you want to have a very realistic picture. But that shows you anger is an important element. The anger there is thumos, not the orge, but there's no reason not to see it as synonymous at that point. To be angry at the right person at the right time and for the right purpose and in the right way, that's not within everybody's power, and that's not easy. A quote, by the way, that the book Emotional Intelligence starts with, because Goldman has read his Aristotle. What would you say that one has to do with? What do you think? Is that looking at it from just the emotion? Is it looking at it from a moral perspective? Is it interested in how we get angry physically? What do you think? You can shout it out. The moral dimension, yeah. To be angry with the right person at the right time. How should we be angry? Bursts of anger or fits of terror when once they've excited such motions are not at once allayed, even though the angry or terrified person set up counter motions but the passions continue to move on. This is actually from one of the works about the psyche. And this has a physical aspect if you read further into that passage. But this is about human psychology. Once we get angry, is it easy for us to stop being angry? It was, saying back in Aristotle's time. If you think about things that make you angry, you will continue to be angry. Anger is a desire accompanied by pain for apparent retribution aroused by an apparent slighting against oneself or those connected to oneself, the slighting being undeserved. There you have a definition, right? Anger is, and it tells you all this stuff about anger. This is not about whether anger is right or wrong. This is about how can we define this emotion that we experience. And you notice, in order to define this emotion, he's got to throw a lot of things in there. Anger is not a simple emotion, even though it feels simple to us when we're experiencing it. If we analyze it, it's actually quite complex. I'm going to skip through these others. You get the point. You can look at anger from a lot of different perspectives. These are Aristotle's texts that either directly talk about anger or which sort of, in a side passage, touch on anger. You notice there's a lot of them. This is a good part of the Aristotelian corpus. There's no one single text that if you wanted to study this, you would focus on. I would say if you had to pick 4, it would be the Rhetoric, the 2 Ethics, and perhaps either On the Soul or the Topics. But you would still leave some important things out if you didn't read the Politics, or if you didn't look at, there I have the Poetics up there, or the History of Animals, the Parts of Animals, or On Memory or On Dreams. So, when I first started writing about this, about close to 10 years ago, originally I thought of it in terms of 3 sort of overlapping dimensions by which Aristotle was analyzing anger. I could see that he had an interest in what goes on with us physically, what goes on with us with our body, our soul. Not a great interest in that, by the way, but some interest in it. So there's a level at which he's analyzing anger and looking at how does the body act when it's angry. And then he looked at the emotion. What is anger like? What causes it? What intensifies it? What dulls it? What causes it to go away? So there's an emotional or psychological level. And that and the physical somatic level are tied together for Aristotle. Aristotle doesn't think that we're sort of disembodied souls just kind of floating around until we smack into a body. He thinks that we are our bodies, and that the soul is the form of the body. So what goes on with our body when we're getting angry is important. It's not the whole show, but it is tied together with that. And then it's clear that he has some views about whether anger is right or wrong, good or bad, and when that's the case. So there's a moral, or as I call it here, an ethical proeretic level. And there's a lot of jargon in it, so I'm just going to go through and tell you a little bit about this. So there's a physical somatic level. Aristotle's trying to explain what's going on with us in terms of the physics of living things, what we call biology, right? There's an emotional or psychological level, an ethical or proeretic level. Proeresis is Aristotle's term for what we often translate as deliberative choice. In Epictetus, who's a later rhetoric, it's translated as moral purpose. And you can think of the proeresis as the fabric of a person's character, who that person is. It's a product of the choices that they habitually make. It's what they bring with them to each situation. There's some other dimensions, too, that I found. As I was looking at this, I tried to shoehorn everything into these 3 levels. And I found out that wouldn't actually work. There were some other things that didn't seem to fit that well. And so I had to recognize some other dimensions to it. I'm actually, to be honest, I'm still not entirely happy with this scheme, particularly with the last one, and I think there may be some other dimensions that have to be distinguished as well, so this is a work in progress. But there is a dimension to Aristotle's discussions of anger that has to do with our will. He doesn't use the term will, but you can understand it in those terms, and with practical reasoning. How does anger actually work? What does it make us think about? How does it get us to do things? And then there's a political or legal dimension to Aristotle's treatments of anger. It gets talked about in politics. Anger is a major cause for a lot of things in the political scene. You can look at today's politics, or look at 20 years ago, or look at any part of human history, and you'll see that working. Then there's what I sort of coined a term for this, the responsive thoretic. Thoros is not courage, it's confidence in Aristotle's terminology. It's the opposite of the feeling of fear. We have an anger response that all of you have experienced. It's tied in with what we call the fight or flight response, right? When you're threatened, or when you perceive yourself as being threatened, sometimes if you're a particularly good person, you see another person being threatened, something happens to you, and a lot of it is bodily, but it's not just bodily for Aristotle. Anger can look an awful lot like courage, Aristotle says. And anger can also be part of our temperaments. So that's that dimension as well. And like I said, I'm not entirely happy with whether that's actually one full dimension or not. But I have to think this out a bit more. Each one of these provides intelligibility to our actions. Part of why I wanted to study Aristotle in the first place is if I want to understand anger and how it works, among human beings, and how it affects me and how it affects my relationships with other people, I'm looking for intelligibility. I'm looking for understanding of what's going on. If any of you have ever been to anger workshop sessions or things like that, part of what you have to do is figure out what's going on with you, what takes place when a person gets angry. So each of these provides some intelligibility to things that we're interested in. Each of these dimensions in Aristotle's account informs the others. Each of them is irreducible to the other dimensions. So Aristotle doesn't think there's one single thing to look at that's the key to understanding everything about anger. That's part of what attracts me to his position. That might actually turn some people off, people who like things to be very simple. Aristotle is not going to be for them. Because Aristotle sees that anger is a complex human emotion that's tied in with all these other parts of our life. So these are some of the implications of that. No one single dimension is going to be the key. You can't just look at the rhetoric. You can't just look at the Nicomachean ethics. You can't say that anger is uniformly, unequivocally good or bad, or works always in this way, or anything like that with Aristotle. Also, if you want to have an adequate understanding of anger, if Aristotle's right about this, and I do think he's capturing a lot of important things, an adequate understanding would have to take in all these different dimensions. So far as I can see, this hasn't actually been done with work on Aristotle. There's some articles out there about Aristotle and anger. Stephen White is an important thinker in that respect. There's a book out there that tries to take the notion of thumos and use it for feminist theory about 5 years ago. But nobody's actually just seen what Aristotle has to say about all these different dimensions and put it together. This is a good example of what's going on in Aristotle. In On the Soul, the De Anima, he says, he's talking about anger, and he's not really interested in looking at anger and trying to analyze it down to its bones at that point. He's using this as an example. He says, if you look at certain psychological phenomena, you can look at them as a natural scientist, and you can look at them as what he calls a dialectical philosopher, dialectikos, or another way of thinking about that would be a philosopher writ large, the moral philosopher. The natural philosopher and the dialectical philosopher would define anger in different ways. One is going to define it as a desire for causing pain in return, or something like that. You can tell he's being kind of careless at this point. He's not interested in nailing it down. He did that in the rhetoric. That's a definition that's similar to the rhetoric definition. That's an emotional definition. It's defining the pathos, the emotion that we feel. The other is a surge or boiling of blood and heat around the heart. Now that's a very physical description of anger, isn't it? Do you ever think of anger as being a surge or boiling of blood and heat around your heart? That may actually kind of correspond to your experience of anger a little bit. Do you feel your anger here when you get angry? All of you get angry, right? Do you feel it maybe out here or something like that? This is tied in with Aristotle's biology. He's got this whole theory about, heat and the heart and blood and what it does. And we don't actually have to buy into any of that to see how, this is kind of an interesting thing. He's trying to look at it in that way. This is the way I'm trying to sort of conceptualize these. And this, two-dimensional charts, are they ever going to really capture a complex phenomenon? No. But what we've got is we've got a sort of physical somatic basis that's always going to be there so long as we're beings that are bodily. And that's just sort of the start of the show. The most comprehensive level is the political level for Aristotle, because we are beings that live and have our meaning in community. And you can't escape that for Aristotle. And then as we move closer to the actual phenomenon of anger, you've got this whole ethical dimension of anger. Whether anger is good or bad, appropriate or inappropriate, right or wrong in this way. And that takes in these other things which in some way interact in ways that Aristotle never makes clear with the physical basis. It's clear that he thinks that they do interact. It's very unclear precisely how they would interact. So you don't have to worry about that too much. But these three things, they have ethical implications, but they're not directly within that sphere, and they are distinct from each other. They influence each other, but they are topics that you can look at in their own right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about each of these dimensions fairly quickly, and then we're going to look at, using these handouts, two of the dimensions very quickly as well, and then I'll take some questions, or comments, or concerns, or whatever. So the physical somatic level. Like I said, Aristotle is not particularly concerned with giving us any sort of comprehensive understanding. If he did, it probably wouldn't be any good for us anyway, because we don't buy into his biology anymore, right? We know that there's some things connected to anger, that our blood pressure does actually go up, but it's not because the human being is actually heating up and the blood is getting hotter. That's what Aristotle thought. That's better than no theory at all, I think, but it's not one that we would find today, find useful today. Aristotle does think there's some sort of complex interaction between the mind or the soul and the body. Precisely what it is, he doesn't tell us, and what it is exactly for anger, he's unclear about as well. What he's doing here is something like a phenomenological account, not a Husserlian phenomenology. I just mean he's paying attention to experience as best as we could draw on it at that time. And the key things that he's thinking of with this physical level is movement. Movement in terms of the heart being affected or changed, heat, hotness and coldness. If the blood gets cold, then we feel fear or things like that. When we get angry, the blood is hot. That's why we get reckless when we're angry. And the circulation of the blood itself. That's the way he's thinking of that. And I think this is important to look at. I'm not particularly concerned about this for the book, but I want to at least acknowledge it. Then we have this very complex treatment of Aristotle. The heart of it is in the Rhetoric, but it's spread throughout a whole bunch of other works. If you look at the Aristotelian text dealing explicitly with anger, you notice there's about 7 or 8 different texts in which he's talking about this dimension. He does devote a lot of attention to this. He's developing it systematically. He does say a few things that we might think are a little strange, like he says that people who are experiencing other people's anger don't feel anger towards them in return, which we know is not true, because all of you have probably gotten angry at somebody for getting angry at you, right? But almost everything else that he says makes sense in some way. He He develops a very complex definition of anger that we're going to look at a little bit later, portions of which get used in his other work, so he's presupposing this. He focuses on how anger gets caused, what makes it more or less intense, and how it ends. And in the rhetoric, he's interested in if you're somebody who's communicating and you want to manipulate emotions, you need to know about the emotions. How do you actually make people angry? What's the best way to do it? How do you direct anger so it doesn't end up getting turned against you once you arouse it? That's an important thing too. He also looks at connections between anger and some other affectivities, like friendship and hatred. That's one set of opposites that he ties in with anger quite a bit. And also shame, the sense of shame. That can often trigger anger or intensify it. And he analyzes some specific dimensions of anger, which I give you in the handout, and we're also going to look at a few of those later too. So that's the emotional dimension. Then we have an ethical dimension, the dimension where we can start talking about not just how we feel or why we feel that way, but whether it's good or bad, whether it's right or wrong. He treats this systematically as well in the two ethics and bits and pieces in some of the works. And the focus there, because Aristotle's a virtue ethicist, is on analyzing it in terms of virtues and vices. And what are virtues and vices? Those are good or bad habits or dispositions that produce actions, emotions, habits, choice, attitudes, or direct them or bind them up together. They're part of, what make us the kind of people that we are. He frames it in terms of the right measure or the mean. That's why he says, it's not easy to figure out how angry you ought to get. That's the right measure. And he distinguishes between a number of distinct vices and virtues. We often present Aristotle in a thumbnail sketch as if for any given issue or action or emotion, there's the good virtue in the middle, and then there's a vice of deficiency, the not enough, and then there's a vice of excess, the too much, sort of like the Goldilocks story. One porridge is too hot, one porridge is too cold, one of them is just right. When you actually look at Aristotle, he does that with some things, but he doesn't do that with anger. That's another thing that makes anger kind of interesting. He distinguishes at least 4 different vices of excess with anger. And why does he do that? Well, because he's not just throwing a schema out there. He's actually looking at what happens when people get angry. How do they go wrong? How do they screw things up? How do they screw themselves up? We need to be able to distinguish between different modes of that. Then there's this other dimension. Like I said, one that I didn't recognize at first, but now I think has to be understood as a distinct way of looking at anger in Aristotle. The volitional or practically rational dimension. And this one is very important for Aristotle, but he never treats it systematically. So we have to put together a picture out of passages here and there. And it focuses on giving in to anger as a mode of weakness of will. That's weakness of will. That's one aspect of it. Sometimes we call this incontinence or acrosia. We've got a lot of different terms for this. He also focuses on how responsible is the person who's getting angry for what they do as an angry person. How much is in their control and how much is caused by something else. That's something that he's very interested in analyzing. And he looks at how does anger affect our practical reasoning. Another one of the things that's interesting about anger is Aristotle says anger is more rational than the other emotions. He actually likens it to servants who are, they're good servants, but they don't really pay attention to what's being told them. So they hear the very first part of something, and then they go off and start doing it. And sometimes, students do this with assignments, right? You say, write a 5-page paper, and they start writing it, and then they don't realize, well, I wanted you to write this kind of 5-page paper, right? They had to have this, and this in it. Aristotle says anger is like that. It sees that there's some sort of insult or something, going on that bothers us, and it jumps to the conclusion, I ought to hurt that person, or I ought to retaliate. It's carrying out a reasoning process. It's tied in with practical reasoning, but it gets it wrong in some respects. Then there's this political or legal dimension. And again, this is not systematically treated. We have to reconstruct this. Anger has an important role in politics for Aristotle. Not just for Aristotle, for a lot of other political theorists as well. Thomas Hobbes, for example, Thomas Aquinas. Anger has a very important role in what Aristotle calls factional strife. The kind of breakdown of society that takes place, not just along class lines or interest lines or stuff like that, but along moral lines that destroys communities. Anger has a very important role in that. So if you can understand anger well, you could potentially intervene and maybe keep that from happening. He also focuses on laws governing the violent actions or words that arise from anger. Aristotle sees a role for laws in curbing vice and promoting virtue. Some people say you can't legislate morality. Aristotle would say that's part of the point of legislating. As a matter of fact, that's the main point of legislating. And he's pretty characteristic of ancient and medieval thinkers in that way. He also focuses on anger as a more or less understandable cause for wrongdoing in legal affairs. So in the Rhetoric, for example, he'll say, well, maybe your client got himself in trouble precisely because he was angry, and you're going to argue before the jury about what he did and say, well, it's not that big of an offense because the consequences were bad, but his anger was moving him. It wasn't just malice or a bad character or something like that. But that's a political dimension, I think, because it has to do with the way we live together. And then finally, there's this other dimension, which again, maybe this is just sort of a miscellaneous junk drawer kind of thing, where I'm throwing too many things in that don't actually belong together. But these seem to be related to me. I'm perfectly willing to hear why they're not connected at all, or why I should treat them as separate issues. Anger is a response to danger. And Aristotle says it produces confidence, it mutes fear, and it ties in with the virtue of courage. As a matter of fact, when he's talking about these 5 different types of courage that are not exactly the virtue of courage, but are kind of like it, anger, and incidentally love, being motivated by love, saying protecting your children who you love, or your wife, or your husband who you love. Those are like courage. Those are a type of courage. He also focuses a lot in his discussion of parts of animals and things like that on temperaments. And he says something really interesting that I want to share with you, which I think it's not distinctive to Aristotle, but it does express him well. He thinks that different animals have different temperaments. I think that we would more or less agree with him. We would say that cats in general behave in different ways than dogs in general behave, which behave differently than, say, rats. Whether it's more malleable than Aristotle thought, I suspect that's the case. Aristotle thought that certain animals were more choleric, more prone to getting angry towards exhibiting violent behavior, that sort of thing, like bulls, for example. And he had a physical explanation for it. The bull has a lot more fibers in its body and its heart, and that transmits the blood a lot easier, and so therefore, it's able to get hotter quicker and all that. But we can put all that aside, right? So Aristotle thinks that different animals have different temperaments. Some are very nice and gentle. Some are, prone to anger. Some are more loving. All that sort of stuff. He says human beings are different. We could be any of these ways. And we're unlike the other animals, not only because we have logos or speech or reason, but because we're more differentiated than they are. We can potentially be like any of these things that the animals can be like. And this leaves a door open to what gets called the theory of the temperaments, which makes its way into medieval thinking about how the body is connected with our emotions and things like that as well. Again, I don't know if this really should count as a dimension of its own, but I'm willing to for the time being, while I'm working on the book, call it that. Once again, here's that schema that I came up with now that we've gone through them. These are how I see them being connected with each other. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit before we start doing the Q&A about two of these dimensions, just little bits and pieces of this. So this is part of the emotional dimension. This is the rhetoric definition of anger. You notice it's quite complex. And the Greek transliterated characters are not showing up as well in PowerPoint, which is a shame. So Aristotle says anger is a desire, a type of desire. Orexis is the most broad term that we have for desire in the Aristotelian stuff. Accompanied by pain. Anger is painful. It's not just painful to be angry. You get angry because you get hurt, right? Quite often. It's a desire for what? For what he calls apparent retribution. And this term apparent, phenomenes, could mean retribution that's visible, that we get to see. Retribution that you think is retribution. Maybe you're not actually affecting the person, but so long as you can think, yeah, I got them back. It's apparent retribution. Aroused by, now you notice that same term showing up, apparent slighting. Slighting is a term that you might say, well, that's not really what gets me angry, getting slighted. But if you understand what Aristotle means by that, it's oligorios, which means sort of, to lessen somebody. Some of the forms of it, kataphronesis, to look down upon somebody, to treat somebody as if they don't count, as if they're not as valuable as you are. But apparent slighting. Notice, anger doesn't have to actually be inspired by an actual slighting. All it takes is that the person think that they've been negatively affected in some way, treated as less than they ought to be treated, or as having less value. And they're angry. This can fit in with the moral aspect. Maybe people who get angry too quickly, there's something wrong with the apparent part there, right? And who do you get upset about? Do you get upset about slighting against anybody out there on the street? If you do, you're probably going to be a very angry person. We tend to get angry about things that have to do with ourselves or people that are connected with us. And these can even be people we don't like. Sometimes people will get angry when somebody else disparages one of their family members who they don't like, but it's their family member, so you don't get to talk about them that way, and they exhibit the anger response, right? The other thing that's really key to this is that the slighting is undeserved, at least in their view. Maybe the slighting is actually deserved. Maybe some people, behave like jerks and they should be treated like jerks, but then they get angry when they get treated like jerks, don't they? Because they think they don't deserve to be treated like jerks. This notion of deserve, this is what ties anger in with justice and injustice. And Aristotle thinks that this is involved in every instance in some way or another. Now notice all these different components there. Some of these are what we would call judgmental or perceptive, or perhaps you might want to say cognitive. Some of them are purely affective. Aristotle does think anger involves pleasure too. He doesn't have that in the definition, but he almost immediately after that in the Rhetoric talks about the pleasure of being angry. And this is why some people can get addicted to anger. He actually quotes a verse, I think it's from Homer, where he talks about anger as being sweet as honey from the comb. I think that's from the Iliad. But you notice, all of these things are involved without us realizing it, without us, really knowing what's going on, in our getting angry. I'm not going to go through all of these dynamics. This just gives you an idea of the sophistication of Aristotle's attentiveness. He says, people can get angry at a person not for what they in fact do or have done, but for what one assumes they are likely to do or will do. We sometimes get angry in the future tense. Right? We get angry at people not for what they've actually done, the past, the dimension of actually, Aristotle says, justice and injustice, but for what we think they're going to do. Or maybe they'll do it. Or they're the kind of person who would do it. We can exhibit the anger response for that. People also get angry when another person prevents or hinders or even fails to help when they feel it's due to them. That was something that they want. Even bothering a person in a state of unsatisfied desire can make them angry. We've all had the experience of trying to get something done and somebody bothering us and we blow up at them. Or if you haven't had that because you're a good person, somebody's done that to you, right? Aristotle was noting this back in his time. This is kind of a side note. Sometimes people will say, oh, you know, we can't talk about the emotions of ancient times because they lived a very different life than we did. You know, really we can't talk about the emotions of anyone, and they'll set, you know, various boundaries from 1800 before, or 1700, or 1600. It doesn't appear that way. The things that Aristotle are saying are dynamics of anger that we can recognize in our own time. If we do a lot of historical reading, we can recognize them in almost any time. And you can see this cross-culturally. People get angry when events go contrary to their expectations. Now, does that mean that there's an actual target of this person wronged them? People get angry at the win. People get angry at the lotto because they didn't win it. People can get angry and feel themselves slighted or wronged in some way from all sorts of things. When I was a kid, I used to kick a tractor that wouldn't start when I wanted it to. Completely stupid behavior. But that was sort of typical anger response. This is a really interesting one. People become angry when what they value, or literally in Greek, what they take very seriously. This word, spoudazus, to take seriously, to study, to have zeal about. It's what we actually get the word spoudios, meaning sort of a person who's earnestly trying to be a good person. When what they are interested in or care about is denigrated or treated contemptuously by others, like if you're into stamp collecting and somebody talks bad about stamp collecting, you're probably going to get angry. And I didn't put this up here, but Aristotle has another remark that makes this even more interesting, which I think is also true. A person who feels themselves very secure in, say, philosophy won't get upset when philosophy is disparaged. A person who feels themselves not quite so good at it, or maybe on their way, or they think that others are not seeing them in the way that they want to, they will get angrier about it. So people who are insecure about stamp collecting will get angrier when you disparage stamp collecting than somebody who's just fine with what they do. So that's the emotional dimension. And that leads us naturally into this ethical dimension. What matters with virtue and vices? These are all the things that Aristotle says matters when it comes to anger. How one is angry, the motive, you might say, the tenor of it. With whom one is angry. Do we ever get angry at the wrong people? I see it happen all the time. I do it. I think we've all done that. Sometimes we're angry at one person, and then another person just says hello. Now we're angry at them too, right? Or we think that they're tied in with this other person that we're angry at. On what grounds? Why do we get angry? Aristotle thinks there's some things that we ought to get angry about. There's other things, probably most things that we get angry about that we shouldn't get angry about. How long? This is a big one. Is our natural tendency to hold on to anger longer than we should, or to let it go quicker? What do you think? Quicker, right? No, longer. Now this is every culture just about. Up to what point one is right or errs in being angry. This is a hard one for you to figure out. Angry people think that they're doing the right thing. That's part of what it is to be angry. There's something about anger that clouds your judgment and changes your evaluation of the situation. So now the anger is like fully justified. That's part of what makes it so seductive. These are some of the dispositions that Aristotle talks about. Not all of them in the nick of it. There's people who are quick-tempered. They get angry quicker than they want to with the wrong people over the wrong things. But one good thing about this kind of vicious disposition is they get over it quick. So these are hotheads. You may know some hotheads. Hotheads you can probably work with. You just get out of the situation and you come back and now they're okay. Not so with the rageful, the acholoi. They get angry quickly and over everything. And it doesn't necessarily go away. And so you might think of these people as the people who, their whole life is just, shot through with anger. Then there's the bitter temper. You know these too. They remain angry for a long time. Why? Because they keep their anger in. When you're angry, you desire to have some sort of, setting things straight, what Aristotle calls timerasis. We translate it as retribution or revenge, or there's a lot of R words that we use with that. These people keep their anger in and they become resentful. They guard their anger, but they're going to find some way to get it. And the pikroi, pikros means sort of bitter or piercing. Think of like the taste, there's a taste word that's actually used in Greek for certain kinds of food. These are the kind of people who you can tell that they're angry. They won't come out and tell you until they're able to take their retribution. Then there's the troublesome. I actually, have translated this facetiously in some writings as pains in the asses. They just make trouble about things. They're always unhappy. They're grumbling about things. They become troublesome, haliponantas, more than they should. That's a verb that's used for a particular kind of anger in Greek for a longer time, and they won't be reconciled without some sort of retribution or punishment. And then finally, you have the people who just, go out and start beating people up, or swearing at them, or doing all sorts of things. Those are the violent or the abusive. They engage in retaliation right away. And what Aristotle means by calling them vicious is this is part of their character. These are the people who get in a lot of bar fights, or things like that. They're the people that you see on cops sometimes. Now, it's also possible to go wrong, although you notice there aren't 5 different ways of going wrong with respect to the vice of deficiency. Aristotle actually only talks about one way. You don't feel anger when you should. You don't feel as much of it as you should. You accept insults and humiliating treatment. At one point he says they don't get upset when you strike them. That's pretty experiential language right there. They feel the pain associated with anger, but not as much as they should, or not as quickly, or not for the right time. And this is a very different sort of ethic than you might find in, say, medieval monasticism, right? Where once Christianity and Judaism and Islam start infusing their way into philosophy. Aristotle thinks if you don't get angry when somebody strikes you, there's something wrong in the situation. You shouldn't accept insults and humiliating treatment. And so this is a vicious disposition. And then we have the virtuous disposition. And there's different ways of translating this. Gentle is one way we translate it, good-tempered, mild. Here's a kind of interesting bit of connect the dots stuff. What gets translated in the Bible as meek, in the Greek stuff, it's the same word as the word Aristotle is using that we translate as good-tempered or mild. In the Septuagint, when it says Moses was meek, it's praus, same as this. And then they talk about the meek inheriting the earth. It's the praus, those who have prautes. There's different conceptions of how one would be mild or meek, I think, going on there. But it's the same term, the same thing going on with that. And it does have to do with being forgiving. This person either does feel and act from the emotion, but they do so in these ways. They get angry at the right time, to the right degree, with the right people, as quick as they ought to, for as long as they ought to. There's all these different qualifications. And there's no, easy recipe for, in this situation you should get exactly this angry. It's something that you have to learn through modeling, experiential. It probably could help to have somebody who you look to that you think actually has a good disposition with respect to anger, give you some advice about, you've gone too far at this point, you're not going far enough at this point. They feel the pain and anger, so they do actually feel it, this kind of person, but as they ought to the degree that they ought to. And he says, this is a really interesting thing. They're not disposed to punish, but to forgive. The word that he's using for forgive there, gnome, is not the same word as forgiveness in the New Testament, which is a different Greek verb, aphiene. And Aristotle does use that word at one point, but for the most part he uses this language of gnome, which we might not necessarily think in terms of like, forgiving 7 times 7 or anything like that, bending over backwards kind of forgiveness, but just sort of letting something slide. Oftentimes, if you can let something slide, when you would be tempted to get angry about it, you'll find looking back at it later that you won't actually get angry about it. The person who has a virtuous disposition will do that more often. Or they may actually feel the emotion slightly or not at all, and they act from reason. This is much more rare. The person who, I don't even know if this person exists. The person who actually doesn't feel angry, but behaves like a person who gets angry to the right degree, takes the right sort of retribution at the right time. He talks about this person as being calm, atharaxos, a verb that's used later on by the Stoics and the Epicureans. Not driven by the emotion, but as reason ordains. I'm not quite sure what to make of this myself. Whether this, maybe there's something more going on here in this description, but I'm not quite sure. So now I'll take whatever questions you've got, or suggestions, complaints.
I think the whole discussion is fascinating. It has a lot to do, I think, with war.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know what he observed, but certainly the Greeks were involved with war a lot.
Yeah.
And
Aristotle talks about courage, and the exemplar of courage is battlefield courage. And the aspect of anger where it mutes fear and promotes confidence, that's something I think he thinks is very important. So, you probably want to get your troops angry at the enemy, because otherwise they're going to be scared of having these spears run through them and all the noise and things like that. The other thing that he says that's really interesting is in the politics. He's not using the term orge for anger, he's using thumos, which could mean something a bit broader. And he talks about the different barbarians and the Greeks. And the Greeks, it's one of those sort of, too much, too little, just right. The southern barbarians, so Egyptians, Syrians, people like that, they don't have enough thumos, so they're slavish. They're willing to let people push them around and tell them what to do, and not fight back, not get angry. And the people to the north, like the Celts, who at that time were real holy terrors for the Greeks, people like that, they've got too much thumos. As a matter of fact, he says they'll fight the waves. They'll go out and, I don't know if there's any truth to this at all, but Aristotle apparently must have gotten the idea from somebody that the Celts would, just fight anything that moved, right? The Greeks have just the right amount, which makes them the ideal soldiers. And he's writing at a time when Alexander is tromping the Persian Empire. And he's doing it with Macedonian troops who are considered to be more, thumotic than the more settled Athenians and, ones that have worn themselves out. The Macedonians were seen as like one step away from barbarians by the rest of the Greeks. So, yeah, wars, I think, another thing to think about is what happens to soldiers when they come home. Aristotle doesn't worry about this at all. But being a soldier, a wartime soldier, means training yourself to get that anger response going. How do you adapt back to barracks or then civilian life afterwards? That could be something he could talk about, I think, but he doesn't talk about it. Yeah.
I'm a little bit curious. I can't remember what you said the Greek term was, but where it gets translated as meek in the Septuagint in the
Oh, praus.
Tempered in
Yeah.
the Aristotle. Do you think that's a good difference of translation there, or do you think it should be interpreted differently in one or the other?
Well, I think that if you look at somebody like Moses, got mad. When we think of somebody being meek, we think of somebody never being mad, putting up with anything. I'm not even sure that the New Testament trials from meekness should be necessarily seen as the person who will put up with anything whatsoever, just suck it all up, take it over and over and over again. So I think I would like to maintain a distinction in translation, but I'd like to say these terms are more closely related. Moses, he was the most meek man, in the Septuagint thing, but he's willing to lead them into battle and kill an Egyptian when he sees injustice being done and things like that. So obviously, it doesn't preclude some sort of righteous anger. Yeah.
Do you find criticisms of Aristotle's theory of anger in the other schools of, like, say, Hellenistic philosophy, and if so, does it shed any light on the theory or help you piece together the theory? Because you explain very well in your talk, you have to take from various different works of Aristotle and try to construct a coherent view from that.
I haven't looked at explicit criticisms of Aristotle in later thinkers. But I think that would be important. Another thing that I didn't bring up with this is there's more texts about anger that are coming. They're not directly Aristotelian. They're written by Aristotle's followers, and then they get attributed to Aristotle as the problems. And so there's a continuing tradition about looking at that. I haven't looked into that yet, but I think it would be important to do. We know from the Stoic moral theory in general that anger was a real problem for them. Seneca has a piece on it, against giving it any real sway. Epictetus says, shouldn't be angry at all. It's never going to be good for them or for Epicureans. Yeah.
Sorry, I have a you were talking about the physical theory and the sort of like blood heating up and boiling around the heart and whatever. Do you think that, and how that ties into just his broader physical theory, that, or is there evidence at least that like it goes both ways kind of with that, where like anger probably may have played a role in his formulation of that theory at all? Because I think those are feelings that we can all kind of understand, but it seems like kind of a weird idea to get from any other emotion,
Well, courage involves, or confidence, tharos involves the blood being hot. That's the opposite of fear. So it's not the only one that he talks about with that. I don't know. I'm not a specialist on Aristotle's physical works. I'm interested in them primarily just insofar as they illuminate the ethical or political works. So, and turns out they don't an awful lot, just a bit, just enough that you ought to have them in the picture, but not enough that they really help us out. You could contrast it to later, much more physicalist theories, which see anger as primarily something bodily. Aristotle, the bulk of Aristotle's work is looking at the emotional, ethical, and volitional aspects of it, and its political implications. Yeah.
So I'm wondering about the relationship between what you're referring to as the volitional practical rationality perspective here, the dimension, and the response to the rhetoric. And I'm wondering if these are just really just two sides of the same dimension, if that makes sense. So on the one hand, what you have is a particular input that you're getting from the responsive theoretic, which results in certain sorts of outputs, which are what you're getting with the volitional practically rational dimension. And if maybe you could just collapse them into one dimension, which would be agential or something like that. I'm curious about
Yeah, I don't think Aristotle's idea about practical reasoning is an input-output kind of thing.
Yeah.
the sort of responsive or theoretic dimension is definitely just a response that takes place, and it is sort of a stimulus response. But then it's what do you do with it? And what I'm looking at with that other dimension is more, how does anger get us to think about the things that it wants us to think about, rather than how does it subordinate reason to itself, you might say, rather than how does it sort of like put reason out of the picture entirely? And then how does it overcome? Aristotle doesn't have a will per se, but he does have this notion of acrosia, and it can be from anger, where we actually know what the right thing to do is. So there's a cognitive aspect to it, not just an affective aspect. And yet we get moved and we don't do the right thing, either by sort of weakness or impetuousness. He says, I don't know, the person's wavering there, right? There's some possibility of thinking I should do something better than this. You might think of it as like, here's a stimulus, and the response goes on, and that's sort of at an automatic affective level.
Yeah.
And then above it is reason that could actually say, hey, don't do this.
Right.
Knock it off. Take a deep breath, something like that.
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Well,
You want to continue?
yeah, I just wanted to just follow up with that, sorry.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking about things that he says in De Anima and De Motu Animalum, and those, it sounds a little bit more, I don't want to use the word functionalist, because that's
Yeah.
of course, that's going to be anachronistic, but I mean, it looks a lot more like that sort of a picture that you get in contemporary philosophy, where you do have, right, you've got desires that are going to be a response to things in one's environment, and then they're causally producing certain sorts of behaviors in an agent. And so that's where I was wondering about that's why I was suggesting that particular connection between the two.
Well, there's causality there. That's clear. And there is some sort of causal interaction between the body and what's going on with that and the psyche. But it's back and forth for Aristotle in often murky ways, especially in on the soul. I don't know, maybe I'm just not understanding his position on this well enough.
Well, I'm not claiming any expertise here at all. So.
Yeah, I don't know, it seems to me that we have desire, orexis, but orexis is a catch-all term that includes 4 different things for Aristotle. 3 of them he says very explicitly over and over again. Orexis is epithumia, desire itself, appetite. Thumos, so this whole, whatever we're going to call that, anger, the thumotic, the irascible appetite. And then boulesis. And that's a bit murkier itself, exactly what boulesis is. Fits in with friendship, fits in with hatred, fits in with a bunch of other things. And then pathos, the emotions themselves are types of desire as well. So we've got different types of desire. So in the De Anima, or like in Nicomachean Ethics, book 6, when he's saying, we have desire, and then that drives things, and then we use reason. It's not just one kind of desire, and some of that desire is already rational desire. Letters is often is translated as rational desire. I think what we have to do is like reconstruct how these things. Aristotle's giving us an underdetermined account. We have to reconstruct how these things actually fit in with each other. And maybe the best way to do it is with something like anger, where we're looking just at one kind of thing rather than trying to come up with a whole comprehensive theory. You hate to come up with a good theory and then find out that some other Aristotelian text contradicts it. When it's all kind of voice. Either one.
I was thinking a little bit about the way you drew your schema, and wondering whether or not there might be an alternative way of doing that, so I'm just going to focus on
I'm sure there's.
So it seems to me, and maybe this in some way problematizes your idea of dimensions. So I thought that could look at this and say, well, look, what's central or belongs at the top, or something like that is what you're calling the emotional definition, right? Like, this is, for Aristotle, the central aspect of this. Then all these other things are basically figuring out applications of this definition, right? So, you take like, okay, the desire, right? You have a definition that says, okay, a desire, right? Then you talk about when is this desire appropriate? What counts as a slight, and what should you view as a slight? Which kinds of slights are undeserved, which aren't, right? So, I mean, could you just make the definition primary and say everything else he's up to is just a way of thinking about aspects of this thing that he's got in place in the
You
rhetoric?
could, but I wouldn't.
Okay, why not?
Well, the reason I wouldn't do that is because I do think of it in terms of these dimensions that inform each other, and I think that for Aristotle, it's very clear that the ethical and the political are more encompassing, and he says they're architectonic. So they are right. It's not just you've got a definition and then sort of applications of it. It would be good to play around with it and find. There's no way to represent in a two-dimensional thing how interpenetrating dimensions fit in with each other, and but I don't want to come up with a model either. I don't know what I'm going to do actually when it comes to this sort of thing. Maybe, maybe the thing to do actually, this means juggling chapters around again, is to say, okay, if we're going to make this primary, like with making the rhetoric definition and the dynamics of emotion primary, and then what would follow if we did make this primary? Here's how this would play out, here's how this would play out, and then maybe look at what if we make the virtue-vice aspect of it primary. This is a side note too, as I've gone on writing this, the book has been sort of reconfigured a couple times as I figure out that I've gotten it more or less wrong at different, in the ways I've been arranging things. So, I guess I'll know that it's done when I no longer shuffle them around. You had a question too.
Oh, yeah, just a small question. Because I don't really work on emotions or agency or anything like that, but what I always find interesting about anger is people who don't have it, but it's not, the badness of that isn't their mildness, it's their cold, rational retribution that doesn't seem accompanied by anger, like the Godfather.
Like passive-aggressive anger.
Or
something.
just like, okay, Jimmy, come here, and then he sends Jimmy out, and Jimmy goes and kills the guy or whatever, but it's like you don't see any anger at all. And I just wondered if,
Aristotle would actually call that hatred. In the rhetoric, he talks about the difference between anger and hatred. And he says anger wants retribution, and it's easy, there's something better about anger because it wants its retribution up front and right away. Hatred will wait. And hatred can be cold, and it can bide its time. And anger wants to see the person punished. Hatred wants that the person not exist, to be effaced, to be wiped out. So it's in some ways more chilling. Another thing that's interesting about Aristotle, where I think he's gone wrong, and where some of the other thinkers, either the pre-Christian like Stoics and people like that, or some of the Christian thinkers who are treating this, Aristotle doesn't think anger is likely to lead to hatred. Other thinkers say, yeah, if you're angry long enough, you're going to start hating the person that you're angry with if you don't resolve it. That's why Augustine said we got to get rid of anger as soon as we can, because anger by itself is not necessarily that bad, but the hatred that's going to come from it, if you let it sit there, is going to pervade your soul. Another thing I should point out, I don't think that Aristotle's account is comprehensive. So I think that we would have to sub in some things that he just didn't treat. Could he have treated them? Probably, but and there's a lot of things where we can use other parts of Aristotle's text where he's talking directly about anger and say, well, this is how he might have addressed that sort of thing. But he just didn't. What we've got is huge, but still fragmentary. So it's unfortunate. It would be nice to have all of Aristotle's works. Oh, yeah.
Do you ever talk at all about the sort of practical benefits of being angry, which is kind of the opposite side of some of the stuff that we've been talking about? Like anger is
I think that it helps you make friends and influence people.
Like the motivational aspect of anger, or, I mean, obviously the not letting people mistreat you would be one, or like being courageous would be another, but, I mean, there are a whole host of them, I think, ultimately. But
What else do you think, to get an idea, what else do you think anger is good for? Why would you want to promote your?
One, thinking of that like Nichols piece, for instance, where Sean Nichols talks about this case apparently where there's a bunch of people that are like, they're all on computers basically, and they're playing this economic game where basically every time someone puts money in the pot, they lose money from their personal stash, but then everybody who's in the game gets some of that money that's in the pot.
Okay.
So it's beneficial for each person to not give it all, and beneficial for all the others whenever someone other than themselves does give into the pot.
Okay.
I know I'm not doing a very good job of explaining that. But he says the way the games work is that in the first number of series, there's no option for punishment, and nobody ever gives because they don't want to lose anything out of their own pocket. And then these people basically add a dimension where they say, now you can economically punish the other people. They interview them and they all say that like they're angry when no one else gives, or when someone gives less than everyone else is, and all of a sudden contributions are at like 90-some%. And the conclusion is moral anger is a beneficial sort of emotion in a lot of different ways, and that would be one of them. Where again, now you're like increasing cooperation and like kind of getting certain actions out of other people that benefit a group.
Yeah, Aristotle doesn't ever talk about that directly. But anger has a kind of, you might say, regulatory role in making us do the right things. If we act like jerks, other people get angry at us, and then we realize, we better not act like that, or we're going to have all these consequences we don't like. But anger is always dangerous. Anger is sort of like controlled burning for Aristotle. It's great. It does a lot of important things, and it's nice to look at the fire too. Even there's a certain pleasure in that. But if the wind goes wrong, or you didn't set up the trenches, right? If you're sort of just playing around with it, you're just a kid walking around doing, I'm going to do a controlled burn, and you start lighting things on fire. Now it's going to be all sorts of trouble. And his society too was a society where there was way more anger going out of control and screwing things up than fixing things, I'd say. But yeah, I think you could talk about that from an Aristotelian perspective. He thinks that praise and blame are really central to how we learn about the virtues and the vices. Another thing I didn't talk about in here, when it comes to the arousing of anger, he talks about the role of mimesis in the poetics and also in the politics. He doesn't go into it in great detail, but he seems to think that we ought to have depictions of people getting angry, that they serve some sort of role. But it's, again, he doesn't spell it out, so we have to do it ourselves.
Just curious, I think that.
I think it's a good idea. Any other questions or complaints? Anybody angry? No. If you want to know, I've got a few writings about Aristotle and the emotions of anger. I've got an academia.edu site where I have my portfolio. I also, if you're interested in Aristotle, I record my lectures that I give in classes, and so those are on YouTube. I've talked a bit about it on some blogs as well. So, thanks for your attention and your questions.